All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon portion of our symposium on political discourse and the impact of campaign finance, redistricting, and the media. My name is Pete Damiano, and I direct the University of Iowa Public Policy Center. And we're very excited to have everybody here, both students, members of the public, and policymakers that are here, as well as our esteemed speakers. And I really want to give a shout out to them. They've come in from all around the country. Not something that's easy to plan to do, coming to Iowa in December and not knowing what you're getting into. And this afternoon, they've got a lot of pressure because the morning session was great. And so, but I'm sure they will do great. But Tracy, who will be up in a moment, Tracy Osborne, has done a great job pulling together excellent content for you. As we get started, I want to give a thanks to, first, our financial co-sponsors for the event, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Communication Studies, Journalism and Mass Communication, the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, and the School of Urban Regional Planning. We have two partners for the event, and that's the Hoover Presidential Library and the Hoover Presidential Foundation, which Jerry Flegel is here from the foundation, and we really appreciate their partnership. And if you're not aware, we recently did an event with them on the history of the Iowa caucuses that's going to be on C-SPAN sometime in December. And we're hoping to also be able to get a copy of that and put that on our website. Great content, both from political operatives who have been involved in campaigns in Iowa for many, many years, as well as people in the media that have covered it. And it's really interesting and sort of fun stuff. Then we've got a number of in-kind sponsors who really helped us get the word out, and the reason that some of you are here that also want to give a little shout out to the Associate Provost for Outreach and Engagement, their office, Progress Iowa, the College Republicans, the Johnson County Republican Central Committee, No Labels Iowa Hawkeye Chapter, the Office of the Provost, the Iowa State Democratic Party, who is helping get the word out. They're not an official co-sponsor because they don't do that. Same with the State Republican Party, but the Johnson County Democratic Party is. We have the Johnson County League of Women Voters, who this really is something that obviously fits very well with what they do, and the Johnson County Board of Supervisors, as well as our planning committee for this event, who is made up of people not just from across campus, but also outside, who did a great job of helping guide a number of these events that are a part of what we call our run-up to the Iowa Caucus series. And this topic of political discourse is just extremely important to not only the Public Policy Center, but the university, because as we create new knowledge and understanding, it's really important that there's people out there that are receptive to receiving this and that we can engage people in really positive dialogue about how to move things forward. So we're very excited not only about the topic, but about this event and being able to share this forward as a part of our community engagement activities. Also, a shout out to our team at the Public Policy Center, Leslie Gannon, our Community Engagement Coordinator, and Alex Sokolsky, our IT Director, and Chrissy Fitzpatrick, the Assistant Director, for all the work that they did pulling this together, and they did a great job. With that, I'm going to turn over the afternoon to Tracy Osborne, who is a professor in political science and also directs our politics and policy research program at the Public Policy Center.
Hi, everybody. I'm short, so I have to move the microphone. All right, welcome back. Some of you heard a little bit of a spiel this morning, but for those of you who haven't, we're really delighted to have all of you here to see so many students that I recognize, since this is where my class came. But we're really happy to welcome you back, and again, the idea of this symposium is really that it inspires information, learning, and debate among those who attend. And so we really encourage you to ask questions. We've allotted quite a bit of time for questions to the panelists after they're done. And if you look at the end of your rows, there's pens and note cards. And so if you have a question you want to jot down, jot it on the card. We'll come around and collect them. And our moderator, who's right in front of me, was going to go through those so that everyone can hear pretty well. So that's really all I have to say, but we're really excited to see such a lovely crowd here, and we hope you enjoy it.
Okay, I'm short too, so this works out really well for me. All right, my name is Julie Pacheco. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department, and I'm the moderator for this panel on media in the modern campaign age. So our first speaker is Margie Hershey, and she's going to give an overview for us. She is professor of political science and philanthropic studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, specializing in political parties, campaigns, and political communications. Her current work has to do with polarization among party activists and with the commonalities among the research on framing, persuasion, lobbying, constructing explanations for election results, political metaphors, and social movements organizational development. That was a mouthful. And she is really one of the sweetest people I've ever met in the profession. So, Margie, happy to have you here, and I will turn over to you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to leave it to the audience to determine whether I'm one of the sweetest people you've ever met. It really is a privilege for me to have the chance to speak with you. I appreciate that. And let me also thank Tracy Osborne and Leslie Gannon and their colleagues for their efforts in putting together such a terrific conference. Okay, what do we know about the impact of media on campaigns? There have been some big changes over time in the way we think about media impact, due in part to the changes in the ways that we research it. Early studies in the 1940s and the 1950s found people's votes in elections could be predicted very well by their vote intentions 6 months before the election, and concluded that therefore media coverage during those 6 months couldn't have made much difference. Instead, people's partisanship did. Several decades later, researchers began to use experiments in which they found that the nature of the story to which people were exposed had a lot of impact. Showing people stories about an issue increased their sense that that issue was important. That's called priming. Giving people a story that offered a particular interpretation of an issue, framing the issue in one way, could persuade some people, sometimes many people, to see the issue that way. So at that time, the media were thought to have a substantial influence on people's feelings about the campaigns. Of course, in these experiments, people had nothing to do except to read those stories, in contrast with normal life when we have a whole lot to do. More recently, we have been more thoughtful, I think, about taking into account the ways that research methods affect their results. We found that both priming and framing do take place under some circumstances more than others, with some kinds of people more than others. A media story or an ad tends to have relatively little effect on people like you, people who are engaged in politics already, and so already know a lot about politics. People who are not interested in politics are pretty good at avoiding most political messages altogether, but the very few that manage to sneak through may make a difference. In general, though, the impact of media messages tends to be short-lived. So the massive impact models have been put on the shelf. Well, at least for the sake of argument, I'd like to dust some of them off for a few moments. Most of us do develop a party identification fairly early in life, and that limits our need for any further political information. Most of us just simply vote our party ID. We don't tell people that in polls, but we do. But even though we don't need to, some of us continue to take in information about politics. This new information may not change our partisanship, but it can still be important. For instance, now in a presidential nominating season, when identifying as a Republican doesn't tell you which Republican to choose. The new information we get is generally mediated. Think about where you're getting information from now. For some whose social networks are heavily involved in politics, new information can come at least in part from those networks. But for the rest of us whose social contacts are formed on the basis of our jobs or on the basis of our involvement in athletics or religious life, the great majority of what we learn about a campaign comes from some form of media. No medium has the time or space to tell us everything that's happening, and even if it could, most of us wouldn't want to know that. I certainly wouldn't. Any medium has to select the information it presents. So it follows that the nature of those media, the ways they're structured, the norms they develop for gathering and presenting information, can make a difference in which information they select to communicate to us, and therefore what we can learn from them. Now, we have a greater variety of media now than we've had at any other time in human history, but they have one important thing in common. Although we think of media as providing a vital public service, that isn't their main job. Most media are privately owned enterprises. They need to make a profit in order to survive. Surviving requires getting and keeping an audience. A media outlet then sells access to that audience to prospective sponsors or patrons or advertisers who in turn provide the funds needed to produce the content. The rest of the media outlets are nonprofits or individuals who still want to reach as many people as possible. That's what they're for. So the editor of the Des Moines Register is not so different from the editor of Politico, or maybe even the producer of a Law and Order episode on TV, in that they don't wake up each morning thinking, how much political information can I teach people today? But rather, if I don't get enough people to read my paper today, or my blog, or watch my program, my job is at risk. So how do the media meet this basic need for an audience? They develop norms that help them decide what to present based on assumptions about what their prospective audience, you and me, want. They know most of us respond more to drama and conflict than we do to peace and quiet. Most of us respond to change more than we do to what's the same. Immediacy has greater value to most of us than does older information. Most of us respond to faces, even faces of cats, more readily than to words. Most of us are drawn to movement rather than to stasis. This is true of our political content responses, just as it is to our responses to sports and entertainment. The broader the audience that a media outlet needs, the more it will seek political content that meets those criteria. There are probably millions of things happening today in the United States and Iowa that have political reference. But if you watch the news tonight, what are you going to see about politics? Probably a candidate making a dramatic statement or a political scandal, or if there is one. I could argue to you that these bits of information have no real importance to our lives at all, compared to what the staff members of the Federal Reserve are doing today. But we're not likely to see a story about the staff of the Federal Reserve on the news tonight because the inner workings of the Federal Reserve just don't score very high on drama and immediacy and conflict and good pictures. Nothing personal about the staff members of the Federal Reserve. Similarly, if your main sources of information about crime are broadcast news outlets, you'll probably come to think of crime as defined by robberies, people shooting one another, because pictures of a crime scene meet media norms, even if they don't tell us much that's generalizable about crime in the United States today. Now, clearly there are a lot of different media, and they can meet the need to keep an audience in many different ways. But there are enough commonalities in the ways that these norms work that they can affect our views over time. Just as the constant stories about the man robbing a convenience store can influence our beliefs about what crimes we need to worry about and how often certain types of crimes occur. Not because robbing a convenience store affects your life more than, for example, insider trading does, but because one provides drama and conflict and good pictures that meet the media's need for an audience more than the other one does. So how do these media norms affect what we learn about presidential campaigns? Let's start with Donald Trump. There are several possible explanations for Trump's dominance of the presidential race so far, and one of them is a media explanation. Successful candidates figure out pretty early that media norms determine what the media decide to cover about them, and they learn how to conform to those norms. Donald Trump is a pitchman and an entertainer. He's had lengthy experience doing just that. Think about the very speech that he used to announce his candidacy. Calling immigrants who are undocumented from Mexico rapists is a great way not just to guarantee one day's headlines, but a whole week's worth of headlines, and perhaps months after that, as other sources respond to Trump's comments, and then Trump responds to those sources responding to his. Not many days have passed when Trump has not said something dramatic or conflict-filled. In other words, newsworthy. Now, you might think, well, the tone of his coverage has often been pretty negative, if not satirical. Nevertheless, although that's the case, at this point in a complicated primary season, name recognition matters a lot in public polling because most people have very little information about candidates. Normally, sheer coverage of a candidate will take him or her only so far. In a multi-candidate open seat campaign, typically one candidate jumps to the front of the pack by gaining media attention, sometimes for what he or she does or says, sometimes for early fundraising success. The media coverage then jumpstarts a virtuous cycle for that candidate, in which the coverage leads to increased name recognition, which raises poll numbers, which bring financial and other support, which in turn generates more media coverage. But after that cycle has completed a turn or two, there's typically a shift. News media need immediacy. They need change. Unless that candidate knows to keep creating drama or conflict or good pictures, there's going to be a pause in that candidate's capacity to drive the news. That opens the door for another candidate to meet the media's needs better. Or during that pause, journalists will look for a new story by delving into the candidate's background, and that inevitably uncovers flaws. People who see themselves as big enough to take on the presidency often have big flaws, and the coverage of those flaws interrupts that virtuous cycle for that candidate. So how come that didn't happen to Donald Trump? Because he's more experienced at fulfilling media needs than his competitors are. His background as a showman has taught him to be a constant emitter of drama and conflict, like one of those machines the pitching machine that you use to do batting practice with. Journalists are too busy covering the shocker that he said today to get into the tall grass of his record as a businessman. The news hole is small, especially for politics. You can't have a lot of stories on the presidential race every day. So Trump has become a wellspring of content by which media keep audiences. That drives up his negatives as well. But he's also tapped into a segment of society that consists of formerly dominant social groups who sense that they're losing their dominance and who therefore feel that the natural order of things is under attack and whose response naturally has been outrage. So does this mean that Trump will eventually win the Republican nomination? Probably not. I wouldn't have said probably a few months ago, but I do now. Both Trump and Hillary Clinton are so universally recognized that they have probably hit the ceiling of their likely support. Clinton's ceiling being somewhat higher than Trump's. As Nate Silver points out in 538.com, Trump now has about 30% of the vote in the polls among the roughly 25% of Americans who are classified as Republicans by pollsters. That's about 8% of the electorate as a whole. Among the rest of us, his unfavorability ratings rank very high. We know from exit polls that even in Iowa, where people are particularly interested and concerned about at least the presidential race, only about a third of those who will eventually attend a caucus will have made their final decision about candidates prior to the month before the caucuses. The Trump supporters are probably in that third. It's hard to find people who have never heard of Donald Trump or who don't yet have an opinion about him. There's plenty of space, in other words, for other candidates to expand their support. And if Trump comes in second or third in Iowa and New Hampshire, you might want to think about how he would respond to losing. It's hard for imagining him staying in the race unless he's winning it. But the attention the campaign has received so far, I think, is an unusually good example of the ways in which the need of the media for audiences and the norms that have developed to meet that need cast a long shadow over what we know about politics and how we feel about it. Let me make a couple of other briefer points about media effects. First, given the explosion of media platforms in recent years, there's a lot of interesting variation to examine among different types of media. For example, some social media, Twitter in particular, Facebook to a lesser extent, carry a higher proportion of negative content than do even some of the most partisan of the broadcast media. This gives us a wonderful opportunity as social scientists to try to figure out what's fundamental about media effects and what varies by platform. But let's take an example of the latter. The broadcast media have traditionally followed the norm of two-handed journalism. If you present a quote that suggests one particular point of view, you need to present the other hand in order to maintain a broad, diverse audience. So if a source says that climate change is real, the reporter feels the need to quote another source saying it's not real. Now, that's sensible enough on questions of pure opinion, should Facebook have a dislike button, for example. It's not quite so sensible on matters of fact. But the problem is that in the current climate of partisan and ideological polarization, which Matt Levendusky will tell you more about later, what constitutes facts has become open to partisan controversy to a greater extent than it might have been 50 years ago. Yesterday, as one instance, USA Today had a story about the Planned Parenthood shooting in Colorado, and the story ended with, on the other hand, some argue that Planned Parenthood was responsible for the shootings because it does abortions. Another example, some political scientists have examined what's called asymmetric polarization. They find that in voting in Congress, Republican members of Congress have moved to the ideological right to a greater extent than Democratic members of Congress have moved to the left in recent years. As a journalist, how would you, given the two-handed norm for broadcast media, report that story in the broadcast media? Could you report that story in the broadcast media? Most likely, needing a large and diverse audience, you could report these findings only by presenting that evidence and then quoting another speaker saying, no, that's not the case, or that maybe the Democrats have gone further to the left than the Republicans have to the right. We have other media that don't face this challenge, blogs, for example, because they pull much smaller, more homogeneous audiences, so they can offer either one or its opposite without worrying about losing readers. But they can also define facts and opinions without much fear of contradiction. So even though they differ in the ways they try to keep their audiences, the broadcast and the narrowcast media, because of their need to keep an audience, both fail us, quite frankly, in being able to distinguish between facts and interpretation. And finally, it's time, I think, to consider again the traditional conclusion that media effects come in the form of agenda setting, that they don't tell us what to think, they tell us what to think about. There's been a very valuable resurgence of interest in political science in the role of emotion in political thinking. It's easier to have an affective reaction to something, I like it, I hate it, than it is to learn much about it. And we've known for some time that some kinds of political issues are what we call valence issues, issues on which most people agree. Many of these valence issues, do you think we ought to have a strong national defense? Do you like the American flag? Are what my colleague Ted Carmines and Jim Stimson call easy issues, questions that carry a substantial emotional charge that elicit gut reactions. The presence of valence issues makes it hard to maintain the idea that media don't tell us what to think, but rather only what to think about. When media attention puts a valence issue on the agenda, an easy issue with a substantial emotional charge, then the line between what we think about and what we tend to think blurs. As an example, a year ago, it may seem very distant now, but just before Election Day in 2014, there was a great deal of media attention on the spread of the Ebola virus in West Africa, and that a few individuals with Ebola were being brought to the United States for treatment. Understandable. It was a great story with which to attract an audience. Drama, conflict, immediacy, focusing on individual victims. Ebola is a pretty classic valence issue. How many of you favor Ebola? It's horrifying, and it was high on the media agenda during the fall of 2014. Its importance to our lives was probably minimal. During a 5-month period, how many people died of Ebola in the United States? What would you guess? 2 people died of Ebola during the United States. During that same time, 13,600 died of auto accidents in the United States, and 13,700 died from gunshots. But a great deal of media coverage was spent on Ebola, not just at the beginning of the story when the level of threat was unknown, but for months after it had become apparent and federal authorities had made clear that the threat to most of us was very low. How come? Ebola was a closer fit to media norms than were the auto accidents and the gun violence that caused 25,000 deaths during that period. Ebola was change. Gun violence is daily life for us. Did the coverage of Ebola, a valence issue that generates a lot of fear, affect voting behavior right before the 2014 election, when we elected all the members of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the members of the Senate? Fear is a powerful emotion. Could it have affected some voters' more general sense of personal security or national security? Now, note that the coverage didn't come about because the media outlets intended to influence public opinion on the state of the nation or to affect election results. It came about because of media norms, because the real media bias is toward its own survival, just as yours and mine is, by attracting viewers and readers. To that degree, it's harder to argue that media coverage influences only what we think about and not what we think. There are a lot of other fascinating questions that can be raised about the impact of media coverage on campaigns, and I will leave it to my colleagues on the panel to do that. Let me simply conclude 2 things. One, that in their capacity as our eyes and ears in the political world, media inevitably create distortions in the picture they convey of American campaigns, with different distortions being created by different types of media, not because they intend to distort, but simply because of the norms they have developed in order to survive. And 2, should we care? Of course, but probably not as much as for the current state of campaign finance, because the diversity of views reflected in the growing and fragmented media universe is much greater than the much more concentrated views reflected by big campaign donors in recent years. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Matt Levendusky. Matt Levendusky is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on understanding how institutions and elites influence the political behavior of ordinary citizens, including studies of mass polarization, the effects of partisan media, and various other topics.
Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming out to hear about this. It's a tough act to follow, but I want to talk today sort of about partisan media in particular, but kind of more generally about media and the way in which they may or may not contribute to polarization. Right, so there's a lot of concern, right, as Professor Hershey mentioned, that the media environment is sort of fragmented, right? So for those of you who are still in college, back in a time when you actually had to get up and change the channel, like it didn't mean clicking around, it literally meant walking across the room and like changing it, and then probably also adjusting the rabbit ears on top of the TV. I'm sure there's a YouTube video somewhere you could watch that would explain that strange process to you. Right? You had 3 choices, right? There was ABC, there was NBC, and then there was CBS, and eventually when I was a kid there became Fox, right? And so there were these 3 networks, and they all basically told you the same thing, right? So they all gave you some sort of very, kind of standard, right, 2-handed approach to the media. On the one hand, on the other hand, right? But that's not what we have today, right? We have this media that presents a kind of proliferation of different views, right? And so I'd sort of like to begin with an example of this, right? So here is, you might remember that a few years ago, President Obama made a lot of headlines for coming out and saying that he supported gay marriage, right? So here's one example of a headline, right? When he did this, this is from CNN. If you can't read it, it just says, Obama announces he supports same-sex marriage, right? And then you can click and there's a little embedded video to play of President Obama saying that he thinks same-sex marriage is a good idea, right? So this is, pretty consistent with that kind of neutral, kind of fact-based journalism, right? But here's an example of a slightly different way of covering the same story. Right, so if you can't read this one, this is from Fox Nation, which is the editorial part of Fox News. It says, Obama flip-flops, declares war on marriage, right? So same story, very different coverage, right? And so this kind of coverage, right, is maybe a little bit more kind of normatively troubling potentially, right? Because we might think that seeing this kind of coverage is going to have more of an effect on people's attitudes, right? So I'd like to spend some time today, and I'll try to keep it reasonably brief, talking about why we think that this kind of coverage might matter, right? But at the same time, I want to suggest to you, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, right, that this kind of coverage and the decline of it matters a great deal as well. Let's start by thinking about, by way of definition, when I talk about kind of media fragmentation or partisan media, what I mean are sort of sources that don't necessarily obey this kind of, on the one hand, on the other hand, style of journalism, right? So this is, if you, watch cable news, Fox News and MSNBC are the two biggest proponents of it. More readily you could find this on talk radio. Think of someone like Hugh Hewitt or Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, those kind of folks. If you read blogs, Instapundit, Daily Kos, those sorts of things, right? So let's start by thinking the most kind of obvious question we tend to get about this, right? Does this kind of content, right, this more kind of partisan content, does it lead people to have more polarized attitudes, right? Does it drive people away from the political center and towards the political extremes, right? And so the basic rationale for this is that this is some sort of echo chamber type of argument, right? And so the idea is that I'm a conservative, I sit down and I listen to, say, Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly, right, Megyn Kelly, and, I hear them repeat back conservative arguments to me, and so I think, like, yes, those are really strong, compelling arguments, right? And to the extent that they present the other side, they do it in this kind of, it's a sort of a caricature of the argument, right? They don't really give it its full force. They immediately discredit it, right? And we know the way people kind of process information, right? We like information that agrees with what we already believe, right? So that makes us more likely to accept these sorts of arguments, right? And so we also know that when we hear arguments that reinforce what we already believed, right, that tends to make us, think like, oh, my position must really be right? So I believe that argument, right, a little bit more strongly, and maybe now instead of just sort of supporting tax cuts, now I support them more strongly, right? But, the trouble with any kind of media study is that there's this classic problem that social scientists think about that's called selection. Is this a selection effect or is this a treatment effect, right? And so a selection effect, right, basically means that the kinds of people who come to partisan media are different to begin with, right? The kind of person who sits down and watches Rachel Maddow or Bill O'Reilly or Megyn Kelly is different than the kind of person who sits down and watches the CBS Evening News, right, or doesn't want to watch any news at all, right? So that's a selection story. A treatment story is the act of sitting down and watching this changes my belief, right? And the evidence is going to suggest that both of these things are actually sort of going on, right? And why do we think that there might be some selection effects? So I want to walk you through just some very quick numbers, right? And so this is how many people watch different TV shows. So I just pulled this up. This is from 2 weeks ago. As we've all, I'm sure, heard, right, the media market has fragmented quite dramatically in recent years. So 2 weeks ago, the most watched program was Sunday Night Football. I don't know who was playing. Sorry, I don't follow sports. But So about 23.5 million, or 23.5 or 05 million people watched Sunday Night Football a few weeks ago. I don't know, maybe it was a good game. So sports almost always is the largest. If there's any major sporting event, that's almost always the largest single sort of show. The largest broadcast show was NCIS. What's interesting about NCIS is that this show dominates predominantly with people who are over 50, right? The only people I know, just looks for what it's worth, the only people I know who've ever turned on an episode of NCIS are all people my parents' age or older. Draw from that what you will. But there's 18 million of them watching it. Right, the number one show in the key cume, which is the key audience demographic, is Modern Family. So the one advertisers pay the most for are people who are between the ages of 18 and 34. So Modern Family is the winner there, although it's not the overall winner here. Right, so then after that, Dancing with the Stars got about 12 million people. I didn't even know that was still on. That was a surprise to me. And then we come to the much maligned NBC Nightly News, which is the most popular of the three major news networks. It gets about 9 million people on average a night. That's down quite a bit from where it was 30 years ago. We'll get back to that point in a minute. But just to give you a sense, right, we'd have to skip way down the list now, and I'm going to show you where Fox and MSNBC are, right? So Fox News in prime time averages about 1.8 million viewers, right? The most watched show on Fox, which is Bill O'Reilly, gets just a hair over 2 million viewers a night. It was up a little bit more last year, but not hugely so. And MSNBC, woe to them, they only get about 775,000 viewers on average across prime time. Their leading show, Rachel Maddow, gets just over 900,000, which is a pretty big improvement from earlier in the year where she was barely even pulling in 775, right? So that notice, right, up here with these more popular shows, right, their audience is massively dwarfing, right, the audience for these more partisan programs, right? So there just really aren't a whole lot of people, right, keeping in mind that there's 245 million or so American adults over the age of 18, right? It's a fraction of 1% who are, sort of regularly tuning in to one of these shows, right? And so I think there's 2 points to conclude from that, right? One, right, the people who turn out and watch these shows are weird kind of ex ante, and I'll show you some more evidence that they're weirder even than this would suggest in a minute. But no offense if any of you, I mean, I've watched them sometimes too, but weird here need not be taken in a pejorative sense, it just means non-ordinary, right? The other sort of important thing that's happened is that a lot of people don't watch the NBC nightly news anymore, the ABC or the CBS nightly news, right? So a long time ago when I was a kid, like if you wanted to watch TV between 6 and 7, that was choice. Right? You watch, there was nightly news, and then there was local news, and that was it. And if you were going to watch TV, that's what you watched. And so there's a political scientist at Princeton, Marcus Pryor, who's done some really nice work showing that, a generation or two ago, when people watched those shows, right, they were more likely to, then go out and vote and participate because they maybe knew a little bit more politically. But now that there's so many different options, right? So I brought up this anecdote to my students a few years ago, and they didn't even believe me that there was a nightly news show that was on at 6, right? Because, why would you watch that when you could watch an episode of, Friends or, stream something on Hulu or watch some, funny cat videos on YouTube, right? Or you could watch Twitch, which I just found out about, which I'm kind of fascinated that you can just watch people playing video games, right? So, the fact that those people have kind of dropped out, they're not watching the nightly news now, right? They're watching sports or they're, watching something from their DVR, if they're watching TV at 6 o'clock, right? Now they know less and they participate less. And the reason that matters is those are the kind of, moderate swing voters that we hear about, right? The kinds of people who are watching Fox and MSNBC, right? They haven't dropped out of the electorate because they really like politics, right? They consume it as a hobby, right? It's these people who are kind of, not very politically interested, but if they'll sit down and watch the news, right? If that's their only option, right? So they know less, right? They're less informed about politics, so they've dropped out, right? So I think that's one of the things, that's sort of an indirect way in which shifts in the media have contributed to making elections more partisan. But another way is, that I'll show you is that these people who watch Fox and NBC are even less normal than this would suggest, right? And so I'm going to show you some data from the 2008 Annenberg National Elections Study where they asked a very detailed battery of these questions. It's actually hard to find data on what people who watch these shows think because it's rare to get enough of them in a sample that you can actually analyze. Right, so just for the sake of argument, there's more Fox viewers in it just as Fox is more popular. It's not meant to pick on them. Right, so I just looked at people. We're going to show you some attitudes of people who don't watch Fox and attitudes of people who do watch Fox. Right, so if you just look at the sample of people who don't watch Fox, about 37% of them are Republican. Right, of Fox viewers, 6 in 10 of them are Republican. Right. And if we look at strong Republicans, right, so people who really strongly identify with the Republican Party, right, about 12% of the non-Fox sample are strong Republicans, but more than a quarter are strong Republicans in the Fox sample, right? Likewise for conservatives, right, and so this is slightly an overestimate, right, because people attach a positive valence to the word conservative. We know that, right, but about a third of non-Fox viewers say they're conservative, but half of people who watch Fox say they're conservative. Right? And if we look at, there's a measure of affect political scientists like to use called a feeling thermometer, where we ask you to rate someone on a scale between 0 and 100. 0 means you don't like the person at all. 100 means you think they're amazing. Right? 50 means you're kind of indifferent to them. Most people, yeah, kind of indifferent towards President Obama. Right? 50 degrees. Among Fox viewers, right, it's at 42 degrees, which is just about a full standard deviation lower. Right? So quite a bit lower among those who watch Fox. Right? Right, so not only are they kind of a small fraction, right, they're different, right? And we could have made a similar, sort of slide that would be equivalent for people who watch MSNBC, right? So that's to suggest to you that there's quite a bit of selection, right, that's going on kind of beforehand, right? These people are coming to the programs differently. But that doesn't answer the question of whether or not the programs themselves change their attitudes. And the answer is, like many academic answers, a yes, but. So does it change people's attitudes? Yes, it does. I can talk more about why we think that's the case. I've done a bunch of experiments on that. And so the reason I think the but is important, though, right, is that the effects are concentrated, right, on people who already come to it who are sort of extreme, right? So the effects come primarily for people who already kind of watch these shows and know something about them. Right? And so, like, part of the reason for that being is that you kind of need to know what to make of the arguments, right? So if I tell you, Obama is a Kenyan, socialist Muslim, right? You need to know, like, what those phrases mean and how you kind of fit that into your evaluation of it, right? So most of the effect for these people, it's not like people who sort of don't, if you sit down someone in a lab and you show them the show, right, if they don't watch it, they're like, what is this? This is bizarre, right? But if you watch it, you're like, yes, this is good. I like this. I can, use this to kind of update my beliefs, right? So that, the evidence suggests that most of the effect is already occurring on people who are already somewhat extreme, right? So it's not that these shows kind of shift the middle of the distribution. They kind of lengthen out the tails of the extremes. And picking up on something Professor Hershey said, I think one of the more important effects, if you've ever watched these shows, right, is it's not so much they build up your own side, it's that they tear down the other side really effectively. And so they have really strong effects on the way people think about the opposition, right? And they like the other side much less after watching them, right? And so, sorry, as usual, I've gone on too long. But so you might say, well, does this matter, right? It's no big deal. Like 1.5% of the population watches these things, right? Does it really matter, even if it makes them really extreme? I want to suggest to you that it probably does, right? For a couple of reasons. One, these people are pretty influential, right? Because the kinds of people who do this are more likely to be, kind of decision leaders in their social networks, right? They're kind of influentials, to pull up an old term, right? And I've done some other work we can talk about in the Q&A, that part of the way that these effects spread is they spread through social networks. So, if any of you maybe had this experience at Thanksgiving, right, you have an uncle or an aunt or a cousin who loves Fox News and they say, did you see that story about, Benghazi and why the Democrats are still trying to bury it, right? So even if you don't watch, right, they're spreading some of that impact potentially to you. So I think there are probably some agenda-setting effects, right, but in a slightly different way than Professor Hershey talked about, right, that these shows keep certain stories alive that otherwise would die. Right, so a good example of this would be the Acorn scandal in 2010, or the Planned Parenthood, sort of story about fetal tissue resales this summer, right? I don't see, now it's hard because we don't observe what the right counterfactual is, but I don't see how those stories would have survived absent partisan media to kind of keep, kind of priming and churning that story, right? And so I'll say, are there any solutions? Probably not. I'm sorry to end on a negative note. So I think the best solution is something this woman in Texas, Talia Stroud, is doing, trying to make news more engaging, but it turns out that's really hard. Sorry.
Thanks, Matt. Just a reminder that if you have a question during the course of the panel, there are index cards at the end of the rows with pens, so you can fill them out, and we will have someone come along and pick them up and then hand them to me at the end. So just a reminder on that. Okay, our next speaker is Daniel Kreiss. Daniel is an assistant professor in the School of Media and Journalism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research explores the impact of technological change on the public sphere and political practice.
Wouldn't it be amazing if UNC and Iowa met for the national championship? I mean, we'd just get that out of the way and say that. I want to thank everyone for the invitation to be here, Tracy and Leslie in the Public Policy School. What I want to talk about today is how campaigning is newly technology intensive and how that has impacted electoral politics, political communication strategies, and ultimately citizenship. And I should just say, this is adapted from my forthcoming book, which is due out next summer, called Prototype Politics. And I'm happy to answer sort of questions about the data and the methods, et cetera, in a Q&A. But I want to do four things today. Is first talk about what I mean by the new technological basis of campaigning. Then I'm going to talk about differences in technological adoption by the Democratic and Republican parties over much of the last decade. And then what I'm going to do is sort of project some of the findings of my book forward into the 2016 campaign cycle and talk about fun stuff like social media and which candidates are using it successfully and how they're using it. And finally, I'll conclude by talking about what I call digital retail politics, which is the ways in which campaigns are increasingly seeking to leverage social media to make contacts with voters in strategic ways. But first, let me start here with the new technological basis of campaigning. I know you guys in the corner are not going to be able to see this, so I'll summarize. This is a quote from Michael Slaby, who was the Chief Technology Officer of Obama 2008 and the Chief Integration and Innovation Officer from Obama 2012. One of the things that he told me when we sat down to discuss the race in 2012 was how when veterans of Obama's bid from 2008 were getting together in 2011 to discuss the re-elect, that the world had fundamentally changed. The world had changed in terms of new platforms. The world had changed in terms of new technologies. The world had changed in terms of the ways citizens were receiving political communication and political news through new social networks. The world had fundamentally changed. So the question was, how were they going to run a fundamentally new campaign because they couldn't run 2008 all over again? And let me give you some examples of how this has changed. This is small for those in the corner, but it's a map of the data architecture from the Obama 2012 bid that was put together by NGP Van, which is a company that provides technologies to the Democratic Party. But the basic finding that I had and political practitioners kept telling me is that technology now underlies every single aspect of political campaigning in fundamentally new ways. Let me just give you some examples of this. So up at the top, you can see sort of the traditional ways we would see technology, data, and analytics sort of underpinning contemporary elections, which is to say, the ways the campaign used Facebook, right? So the campaign would oftentimes be scoring supporters and looking to reach voters on Facebook. Email, right? Obviously a fundamentally new digital technology, a very data-driven practice. But technology now often or also underpins field campaigning in new ways. So if you look on the left, you see in the ways in which all the field operations of the Obama campaign in 2012 were informed by data, right? Which house do you go and contact? Which voter do you talk to? What do you say to that voter? And then what sorts of results are then uploaded into your database on the basis of that conversation that a volunteer has with the voter? And then how does the campaign change its electoral strategy after receiving that information about what's going on in the field? If you look in the bottom part, television advertising is now a data-driven practice in ways that it wasn't 4 years ago or in 2008. So one great example that the Obama campaign's optimizer, which in essence used big data techniques to try to figure out ways to more efficiently tailor and target campaign advertisements to very small, narrow slices of voters. All of this is newly a technological practice. It demands specialized skills, it demands data, and it demands new digital technologies. Let me give you a second example. This is a tweet that the Obama campaign put out on the eve of the Republican National Convention in 2012. It was a response to Clint Eastwood's soliloquy to the empty chair where he was addressing Obama. And it's a very humorous tweet. It says, "This seat's taken." And you could sort of see it was retweeted just within an hour after over 4,000 times. Why is this important? Well, Twitter played almost no role in the 2008 election. Obama's victory tweet in 2008 was retweeted 157 times. Amazing in 2008. In 2012, his victory tweet was retweeted over 800,000 times in less than 3 days. The enormous growth of a new medium. So the campaign very much figured out, well, how are we going to leverage this? We're going to produce content. What's so amazing about this particular tweet is that it conveys no information, right? It's a joke, but everyone is responding to it, including the Obama campaign's foremost audience for Twitter, which are journalists. Campaigns use Twitter for one primary purpose, and that is to influence the professional press, to influence what they're covering, to influence the frames that they're talking about the election with, and to help drive coverage. And indeed, when I went and did an analysis, what I found is that oftentimes in news reports, they were incorporating the Obama campaign's response to Clint Eastwood in the context of their convention coverage, right? Not exactly the narrative that the Republican Party wanted to be pushing at that moment in time. One other example, not Twitter, but Facebook. Obama staffers in 2012 found that they only had phone numbers for 50% of the young voters they were trying to reach. Of that 50%, 85% of those young voters could be reached through the social networks of their supporters on Facebook, right? Fundamentally new technologies, new ways of contacting voters. Okay, so how do campaigns try to keep shape, to keep pace with these changes in technologies, and how have the two parties sort of differentially responded to this? This is some research that I did on the basis of using Federal Election Commission and LinkedIn data. I generated a list of all campaign staffers working in tech on primary and general election bids from 2004 to 2012, and then I looked at their professional biographies. Me and a team of graduate students did this. The first thing that's sort of fascinating is that the hiring has dramatically increased in technology. This is all staffers, technology, digital data, and analytics. So we went big, right? Try to get everybody. So you can sort of see we ended up with a 629 staffer data set. There are enormous differences between the two parties. This is the first empirical demonstration of what is sort of often a common sense that the Republicans had run behind Democrats in this. But Democrats hired 507 staffers during this time period compared to 123 Republicans. Differences in investment. The second thing that we learned when we looked at the career patterns of these people were that Democratic campaigns in particular were trying to keep pace with these changes that I talked about, this new demand for specialized expertise, for understanding of social media, by hiring from the technology industry. Indeed, one of the big findings in the political communication literature and political science literature is that campaigns have become newly professionalized. We found the opposite in the context of technology. We found that campaigns try to deprofessionalize their staffs because technology is changing so quickly that they want to bring in outside expertise from places like the Silicon Valley tech industry. So this just gives you one indication. Again, you can see that jump. Obama 2008 hired 131 staffers in tech. Obama 2012, 342. Of them, in the political field, right, 73 had primary backgrounds in politics. This was the majority of their professional working experience in politics. And 48 had primary political experience in the technology field. Now, I don't have the time to show you the rest of the data, but one of the other things that we also found was the Obama campaign was also going to the entertainment industry, hiring people from places like MTV, people who had specializations in digital content and digital content production, bringing them over into politics to help them reinvent the ways in which they were communicating with voters. Another difference we found between the two parties, and that we argue also very much helped the Democrats sort of accrue their advantage and carry innovations at professional at presidential levels down ballot, is the founding of firms. This is just a social network graph that we put together. We looked at staffers who left presidential campaigns to found new firms. And what's important about the founding of firms is that they institutionalize technologies, practice, knowledge, and skills that are often honed on better funded primary campaigns and general election presidential campaigns, because that's where the money is. And then they carry them across electoral cycles and they carry them down ballot. During this time period, we found that Republicans, 12 of their former staffers, founded 13 different firms, including a number of prominent firms. And you could sort of look at some new groups like Deeproot Analytics, which is now providing analytics and data work for Bush's presidential bid currently. On the Democratic side of the aisle, we found a total of 67 Democratic firms that were spawned by former staffers on Democratic campaigns. So what does this mean? Well, it just means that they created, the Democrats have, a much deeper bench and pool of technology talent, a much deeper bench of folks who were then going on to work for other campaigns, carrying this expertise up and down ballot, and being able to service and sort of bring these campaigns and help to make them more competitive in a world that's fundamentally changing. And indeed, you sort of see these patterns sort of accounted for within the Republican Party's own stock taking. I won't spend too much time here, but the GOP Growth and Opportunity Report, which they put out after 2012, basically recognized that the Democrats were pretty far ahead when it came to technology. All right. Let me sort of project ahead now to 2016. So given that story of sort of the Democratic investment from 04 to 12 and that deep pool of resources, that knowledge, skills, talent, tech that I was talking about, how is this playing out during this election cycle? Well, one of the things that I was very interested in was the ways in which folks, the alumni of the Obama 2012 effort, were carrying that effort forward, right? So just to update that early architecture map, this is what the Democratic data ecosystem now looks like. There's no Obama campaign anymore, but in general, what has happened is that the Democratic Party provides very much the central data infrastructure for the entire party, and it's the infrastructure that a lot of other firms now innovate around, right? So just to take one example, in the bottom right here is an organization called Civis Analytics. Civis was a firm that was founded by the director of analytics on Obama's 2012 bid. What did he do after the election? He took 1/3 of Obama's 54-person analytics team, brought them over to his new firm, and now they're providing the analytics support for Hillary Clinton's presidential bid. Again, that same story of innovation during one cycle and then diffusion between electoral cycles, ending up playing it forward. And that's just one example. There's a number of other firms that are in here that I could talk about that are doing similar work on the Democratic side in technology. On the Republican side, you get a lot of investment after 2012. The argument historically that I make in my book is that that was the first election since 04 they lost that they believed they should have won, and that sparked them to sort of search for ways to do things differently. But in general, what you have on the Republican Party side is a lot more fragmentation. So the Republican Party has been making more investments in digital platforms, data analytics skills. However, they're also faced with unprecedented outside challenges like I360, which is a Koch brother invested firm that sort of has emerged as a rival to the Republican Party in the data and analytics ecosystem. The danger for Republicans is that while the Democrats have all centered around the Democratic Party's data, it all keeps that data in the system, and data is more valuable the more of it you have and the ways that you can accrue it and tie multiple data together. The Republican Party is more fragmented. Let me briefly talk about this. Generally, a couple of the patterns I found in the book about when candidates are actually strong and mobilizing. And there's features of the political environment that tend to reward particular candidate. So this is Ben Carson, who surprisingly, perhaps, has over 4.5 million Facebook followers, fans. He's the most popular candidate on Facebook by far. And one of the things that he's very much been able to do is sort of translate the interest and enthusiasm in his candidacy, particularly among evangelicals, into electoral resources like fundraising. Bernie Sanders has done very much a similar thing in that you can use social media if you're a candidate to translate energy and enthusiasm into those things you really need, which are electoral resources, right? And we've seen that in a lot of the fundraising for Sanders and Carson. Meanwhile, Hillary's bid, I love this logo. This is actually the logo of an effort called The Groundwork, which is an effort on behalf of some of Obama's alumni now working for an LLC that's providing a lot of the infrastructure. And interestingly enough, Eric Schmidt, Google's executive chairman, is a big funder of a new LLC, which is providing a lot of the tech infrastructure for Hillary. So I only have a minute left, I understand. Let me tell you what this means, okay? So digital data and analytics, what does it mean for citizenship? First of all, campaigns are working very hard to figure out how to create whole citizens in data. What I mean by whole citizens is to figure out how to merge somehow all the different data streams that they have on people, whether it's an email address, whether it's a door knock, right? Whether it's an online petition that you sign, whether it's a social network feed that you have. Try to put it together and then figure out who you are and then create relational political communication messaging on the basis of that. What would that enable people to do? Just some examples. Sending direct mail and running online advertisements to people who weren't home when a volunteer came to give a door knock, right? Showing television ads to people who tweeted about particular issues. Personalizing and customizing websites based on offline engagement. And emailing supporters, perhaps, that tweeted about a particular candidate and to try to enlist them in doing something like rapid response around a political event. All of that data affords as well as new communication channels. One other thing, and I will conclude just here in the next slide, is that campaigns have tried to use social media to fashion their supporters into the implements of strategic communication. Why? Because they know that communication coming from the people who support them and that communication rating out through their social networks is going to be perceived as being more credible, right? In a lot of ways that Matt just referred to. So this is NGP Van's social organizer. Basically what it enables you to do is figure out who are your Facebook friends and then contact those friends to give a pitch from the campaign to try to enlist them. And the whole point here is that political communication works best through trusted validators, people who are trusted to pass on that campaign's message. So it's no longer just directly coming from the campaign. They're trying to leverage digital two-step flows of communications between citizens themselves. All right, so, and finally, I'll just sort of say, new technology-intensive basis of campaigning. When you think about the election, you have to think about party network infrastructure, that collection of firms and organizations that exist around candidates, the digital opportunities candidates have to sort of act on them, and finally, the ways in which digital media is yoked into a new form of retail politics. I'll stop.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. And our last speaker for this panel is Kelly Dittmar. She is an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers University Camden and scholar at the Center for American Women and Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Her research focuses on gender and American political institutions, with a particular focus on how gender informs campaigns and the impact of gender diversity among elites in policy and political decisions, priorities, and processes.
All right, thanks for having me and thanks for sticking around. So this has been fun because hopefully what some of this conversation about gender and media does is pick up on some of the types of media and dynamics of media that have already been talked about on this panel. So despite some claims or hope that the presence of women in both major party primaries signaled a gender-neutral or bias-free environment, the 2016 election has already provided plenty of evidence that campaigns, I would argue, are still gender-drained, and media of all types provide windows into the ways in which campaigns remain gendered, from coverage and commentary from journalists and pundits to campaign strategies and technologies meant to manipulate media and use media to reach reach particular voters, particularly women. So I want to start with an example. In a September interview with Rolling Stone, Donald Trump criticized Carly Fiorina's looks, telling the writer, "Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that? Can you imagine that, the face of our next president?" And you've probably all seen this because of the media coverage. But Donald Trump is not the only one who's commented on Carly Fiorina's face. After the second GOP debate, multiple commentators criticized her for not smiling enough. And then after the third debate, the ladies of The View said that her smile in the debate made her appear demented. This is supplemented by the more blatant critiques of Fiorina's appearance all over the internet. So these are just some select tweets, and you could find many more of these, and then news coverage about if she got Botox or should get Botox. In one way, this exemplifies continued attention to and policing of women's appearance, women candidates' appearances. This is not new. Just ask Hillary Clinton. But the reaction by Fiorina and others to these comments reflects, I think, the changing media and gender environment. For example, within 24 hours of when Trump's initial comment from Rolling Stone was released, Fiorina responded on the campaign trail and in TV interviews. That response went viral when Carly Pack created a web ad almost immediately using her voice over the face of a diverse group of women talking about being proud of your face as a woman, etc. This targeted women, but it also energized many women. And I can say it was on my Facebook feed for days, right? So there was a lot of virality in terms of this video. Energized women to come to her side. Then, when The View called her looks demented, another media commentator, CNN's Brooke Baldwin, called them out for double standards, eliciting a much larger response than would have been amongst just those folks who watched The View that day, right? So it became a bigger news story. And finally, Fiorina aligned with women in the media when they began a line of tweets to confront Donald Trump's sexist attacks. So you can't see the very top, but the first tweet was from a Fox commentator who was attacked by Trump. That then led to a conversation with Meghan McCain, who brought Megyn Kelly into the conversation, and then Carly Fiorina jumps in and says, sure, we should all basically have a party. So you start to create these relationships between journalists and candidates. I think that this demonstrates the way that media, particularly new media, has changed campaign coverage, engagement, and strategy, and the relationship between them. Media is, in this scenario, both the problem and the solution, particularly when it comes to replicating or disrupting gender stereotypes, or promoting or combating sexism, whether it's explicit or implicit. So what do we know to date in terms of the research? And my colleagues have touched on a lot of this, but in terms of gender in media, what we know is that much of the research on gender media and campaigns evaluates the extent to which men and women candidates are covered differently in quantity or quality. Work on this from the early 1990s would say that women were covered less, covered more negatively, and that different trend or pattern of coverage had negative effects on candidate or voter evaluations of candidates. But we've seen some variance in the robustness of these findings over time. For example, in recent studies, we see very little difference in the quantity of coverage of men or women candidates. But differences in framing, focus, and tone of coverage are still evident in many, though not all, studies of gender differences in media. Put simply, the most persistent findings show that coverage of female candidates, more often than men's coverage, focuses on traits: personality, appearance, the novelty of them being a woman candidate, over issue coverage. Or even more simply, we talk about this as coverage of hair, hemlines, and husbands. So the bias in coverage, we also know, has implications for women's ability to be taken seriously as candidates and to prove the credentials that they need for the job, which are more often doubted for women candidates because they, despite much progress in politics, remain apart from the norm, right? You're still the outsider to the system. So more research is needed to understand how and the extent to which gender bias in media coverage informs voter evaluations and stereotypical expectations. In terms of what was said earlier, I think this is a different effect to look for, right? It's not even what to think or what to think about, but how voters think about these things. So are they informed by a sort of gender filter through which we see candidates or we see the media coverage of them? And that research needs to better address some limitations, especially within this modern campaign age. So I want to point to 2 limitations. So first, what counts as media? And I think we sort of gloss over this a lot of the time because we just use media very broadly. Some of the variance in findings on gender bias are due to the types of media that are included in the study. So most studies, for example, exclude cable media, but this is where we often see the most overt examples of gender bias and gendered commentary. And I could present some great clips of that from folks like Bill O'Reilly or Chris Matthews or Rush Limbaugh, among others. Similarly, studies often exclude editorial coverage because of the assumption of bias, right? It is inherently biased. However, again, that's where we see some perpetuation of gender stereotypes. Few studies also evaluate alternative types of media. It's harder to study these types. For example, editorial cartoons are hard to code, but they often provide some of the most explicit gender tropes. So these are we have a whole library of these from the 2008 campaign of Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin in particular. Just to point to a few themes here, right? So what we see in some of these are Hillary Clinton as sort of infantilized in a booster seat. Her experience is not her own, but is of her male partner, of her husband. She might be too emotional or too weak to handle international pressures. She might go crazy, which is a trope often used against women. And finally, on the sort of flip side, the idea that women's power or women's empowerment comes at the cost of men, that her power is emasculating. And there's actually a whole series of editorial cartoons with Hillary Clinton and a whip, which goes into this whole trope of sexuality and again, women's power. So some of the most overt biases we see in this type of media, but it's harder to measure and we often don't measure it, and in a way that I think is actually pretty important. Another example, right, is new media and social media, as we've talked about. It's a new frontier for evaluating media coverage and the potential for bias. So while new forms of media provide new ways for women candidates to communicate their messages and to target their messages and combat bias or sexism like we saw with the Fiorina example, they also open the door to even more bias. So I'm just using a personal example here. So when I tweeted after a GOP debate about the sort of mansplaining done by Brit Hume on Fox News in support of Megyn Kelly, immediately I was trolled with somebody who told me I should stick to making sandwiches. That sort of gender dialogue is apparent all over the internet, and to any sort of women or folks advocating against gender bias or sexism, and it happens really frequently and sort of with great virality. The question is, how important is that, right? Should we pay attention? Should we care that this guy wants me to go back to the kitchen or not? Maybe not, right? This gets into the measure of what media we use and what we think ultimately has an effect on our larger conversation in politics and campaigns. So a question here, are there any types of media that are more influential or important to candidates and campaigns than others, whether in influencing strategy, voter perceptions, or electoral outcomes? And how do you account for the echo chamber, right, or how viral these sorts of messages go on social media in that estimation or calculation of effects? And so even if there's fewer viewers of cable news, if they see it and it's repeated in social media, they see clips or they hear commentary, doesn't that still need to be counted, especially if we're talking about the ways in which gender bias persists? The second question I repeatedly have is sort of, how do you define bias? And particularly here, I'm talking about gender bias. So how do you measure it? Is it in quantity? Is it in quality or framing? What counts as bias and what doesn't, which is often a question even amongst the candidates themselves. And does bias look or act the same way when targeting men versus women candidates? And I had a whole series of slides here, but I'll just give one example. So the coverage of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been largely about how hot he is, right, and his appearance. Does that coverage have the same effect as appearance coverage of women candidates? And I would put out there that in some ways sexualizing men, while not positive, does evoke masculinity expected of office holding. The idea that you are still manly enough for the job. But sexualizing women evokes tropes of femininity that are not still associated with leadership, strength, independence, and the seriousness expected of candidates, particularly at the presidential level. So that similar types of coverage or biased coverage may actually yield different effects. So while the evolving media environment provides new and multiple points of entry and engagement that I think can aggravate and complicate the problems of gender bias, I do want to end with how the double-edged nature of this media also means that there are new sites or routes for potential solutions for candidates, feminist advocates, and scholars to challenge underlying gender dynamics that may work to women's disadvantage in what is still a masculine arena of political campaigns. So I'm ending with a couple of potential solutions. One, campaigns can deal with or confront gender bias directly. Lake Research Partners has done some research on sexism and shown that when women candidates call it out, or even better, have a third party call it out for them, then the negative effects of that sexist coverage can be overturned. But campaigns can also try to heat off gendered coverage before it even starts. And I think this gets to Daniel's point about the campaigns really using, in this case, social media to influence journalists more than anybody else. So you see Hillary Clinton as one of her first Instagram post posting about her pantsuits and which pantsuit she's going to wear to her first major campaign event. She owns the narrative if she puts it out first. Right? And so she's tried to use both humor and sort of ownership of appearance coverage in a way to control it. She's done this too with talking about her hair. So you've all heard the line, especially here in Iowa, probably many times, that she won't have gray hair in the White House because she's the only candidate who will dye her hair. She's also compared coverage of her hair to coverage of Trump's hair. Again, controlling that narrative that may be negative against her. Another thing that she's talked about, or in this case Bill Clinton has talked about, is sort of heating off the discussion that was really prominent in 2008 about the co-candidacy between them. And so she said things like, I'm running for my first term, not the third term of Bill or Barack. And then most recently, President Clinton said, I'm tired of the stranglehold that women have had on the job of presidential spouse, sort of reaffirming that he's going to be in this secondary role despite arguments to the contrary. Outside third parties can also use social media to confront the bias, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we're doing at the center, but also in the most recent debate, a group called Misrepresentation has put forth their hashtag #AskHerMore that they've used for the Oscars and Grammys and things like that to try to apply them to political debates to call out bias. And finally, campaigns can use social media, especially for this targeting, so that they're not only evoking gender solidarity against sort of oppression or bias, but that they're bringing up things that might evoke solidarity for women in terms of the excitement or advantage of having a woman in the White House. Another potential solution, maybe we should have more women in the media. And so I could go through all the statistics, but I won't. But just to say that women are highly underrepresented, both as news directors and bylines and on camera. So if we have more women's voices in the media, does that necessarily mean it's less bias? We need to examine that, and we need more women in media to see if that's true. This is Hillary Clinton's press pool, highly female, and so the implications of that are going to be interesting. Finally, the last piece, and this is something I'm particularly excited about. I think that scholars, particularly those of us in the room, don't only have a responsibility to analyze the media, but also to try to contribute to it in a way that elevates the dialogue and can educate, where necessary, the media. So it's easy to criticize them, but we play a role in making them more responsible and more in tune with what we know. So the rise of new media makes this even more possible. At the center, we started a project called Presidential Gender Watch 2016. This is a website. It's also on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, where we curate the news on a daily basis that looks at sort of the gender lens through which we can evaluate what's happening in the presidential race and the coverage of it. It's not meant to be a sort of sexism watch in any way, but we try to provide a research angle to what's happening. So when we see coverage that may be biased, we demonstrate and talk about why it might matter. Let me give you one example and then I'll wrap up. So we were watching the first Democratic debate, and after that debate, Dana Milbank of the Washington Post wrote a glowing review of Hillary Clinton's performance in which he called her a man among boys. And thinking he was doing a positive thing, he did not realize that he would have a fairly swift social media response in a negative way. From folks like Gender Watch 2016 and from prominent media folks like Soledad O'Brien, who wrote WTF, sigh, why would you do this, right? We then proceeded to write an analysis about that. Why was that problematic? More than the sort of just saying WTF, explain why perpetuating the idea that being a man equals success, that women have to adapt to a model of male success is problematic. We then used that to write and explain using the research that we knew. We then tweeted it back at Soledad O'Brien, who then shared it with her communities. And ultimately, Dana Milbank actually went back and changed the language in his article to a woman among boys. So that's one small example, but one way in which we do have some influence in the dialogue, in the media dialogue, and I think is a potential solution, at least for the conversation about eliminating or at least reducing or calling out gender bias. Thanks.
Okay, so it looks like we have about 20 minutes to do some questions. Leslie's walking around. If anybody has any questions, write it on an index card and hold it up, and she'll come grab it and then bring it up to me. So I will start it off with a question, and then I have time to see what these other questions are too. Okay, so this is mostly geared towards Margie's presentation, although maybe several of you can speak to this question. So Margie talked about the media having, thank you, certain norms that that influence the types of stories that they write. This incentive to grab an audience and talk about really sort of dramatic entertainment sort of news stories. So I wondered first what this means for democracy, because on the one hand I could see writing political stories in this sort of dramatic way might bring people in who might not be interested otherwise, but on the other hand I think what's more likely is that there's just a lot of misinformation that goes on. And then two, if it's the case that it's a lot of misinformation, what should we do to try and prevent having this race by candidates to be the most outrageous during a campaign and to say the most crazy things or something like that? Yeah, I don't know how.
That's a toughie. And the reason it's a toughie is that although being a democracy is extremely important to us, we don't have an institution in the media that are designed to protect it for us. That's not their job. That's our job. That poses the challenge. Can we mislead people by having media norms that emphasize conflict and drama and immediacy? Certainly we can. Maybe it increases the interest on the part of some people who wouldn't otherwise care, although their interest may be generated for reasons that don't necessarily help a democracy function. But I think we simply can't expect that the media are going to be able to do that for us. Now, we have another institution that can. It's called the public schools. That institution, we hope over time, can help engender a series of analytical standards by which people can judge the information that they're perceiving. Critical thinking is very hard. Many parents think it's a wonderful idea in the abstract and not so much in the specific when the critical thinking is critical of what it is that they are trying to teach their kiddos. I had noted a couple of different comments from Thomas Jefferson, who when he was in 1787 in France and observing the beginning of the country, was widely quoted as saying, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter," and there's a coda on there that is not often repeated, "but I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them." 20 years later, at the end of his presidency, he said, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. I really look with commiseration over the great body of my fellow citizens who, reading newspapers, live and die in the belief that they may have known something of what has been passing in the world in their time." That's the big challenge for all of us, isn't it, as educators? And I think that's one that we have to take on, rather than expecting the media to do it because they simply can't.
Yeah, I'll follow up with one sort of related thought. So people sometimes ask me if I worry about media bias, and if people are interested, we can talk more about whether or not the media is biased one way or the other. And I say yes, but not for the reasons you think. My concern isn't about media that's biased one way or the other, because the evidence suggests that that's much more muted than people think. That the much bigger bias, as you sort of heard in all the presentations, is toward the sort of newsworthiness, the kind of exciting novel stories. And one of the things we know is that makes people sort of cynical, right? So hearing a story that it turns out that Medicare and Social Security work pretty well, right? The fraud rates are relatively low, right? Hearing that's like not super exciting. Like would you really start in a story that says government program usually functions effectively? It's much more attention grabbing to say scandal found when people abuse welfare or something like that. That by emphasizing it in a negative way, people think like it sort of reinforces people's beliefs like, oh, this doesn't work well, right? I should be skeptical of these kinds of programs, that there can be a danger in doing, the media watchdog role can sort of be very much a double-edged sword. But again, part of the reason why it's hard to change those things is that the media's incentive to sell stories is to package things in these more sensationalistic, conflict-ridden sorts of ways.
And that's okay. There's nothing that can stop the media from doing that. Then the responsibility is for those of us who are consumers of media to be able to say, is there some slant? Is there some distortion here? If so, what is it? And can I use the body of information that I have developed over time? Boy, would that be wonderful if the public schools could be absolutely assured that by the time people graduate, they had developed a substantial body of information about government and democracy and politics over time with which to judge this portrayal.
Another question here, specifically for Matt, but others can jump in as well. So we hear a lot when we talk about biased media, Fox News versus MSNBC, and those are sort of the prime examples that we give. What about PBS and NPR? These seem to be a little bit more neutral and balanced, and both tend to go more in depth into the stories that they're talking about. Where would you place those news outlets, and what do you think the influence of those are on people?
Yeah, I mean, those are sort of the outlets that come up more in the middle. So there's a famous study by someone who now describes himself as a recovering political scientist. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Tim Grosclose, who's a scholar at George Mason, right, where he did a lot of analysis of different media and found that the PBS NewsHour, which used to be called the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, right, is sort of the modal, it's the most moderate, kind of in the middle news outlet. And I think, they try to follow that norm pretty carefully. The issue is that, I like listening to those things, but if you've ever watched them, they're not exactly the most exciting things in the world. They don't really grab your attention in the same way, and their audience numbers reflect that. And their audience, tends to be skewed much more towards an older, much better educated audience than other things. So, they are a great service for what they provide, but they provide a very particular service to a very particular segment of the population.
So, just to I guess sort of speak to some of the discussion over media that we have here. You know, the era of consensus in the United States and professional press probably lasted from around the 1940s until the 1970s or 80s before it started to revert back to a more polarized, perhaps more the historical norm in American democracy. During the era of strong mass parties, you know, we had upwards of about 90% participation in elections among those who were eligible to vote. And in part, it was because they were big spectacles. They were torchlight parades and they were booze-soaked, and it was a politics of social attachment, as the historian Michael Schutzen has sort of argued. And I think, as Margie bringing up Thomas Jefferson's quote before sort of suggested, is that we've had a very long history of sort of bemoaning the quality of democracy and information and the civics capacity to engage in rational, enlightened, sort of Habermasian discourse. So I would just kind of sort of say that, like, maybe politics shouldn't be like NPR or the McNeil-Lehrer report, that maybe a more performative and agonistic and clashing and entertainment public sphere might not be a bad thing necessarily all the time if we want to think about, like, people being engaged and caring and debating issues and wanting to participate itself. It seems like we have very much a set of norms or standards that I just worry are kind of impossible to achieve, and that even when we might come close to them, like, the real world sort of intrudes on us again. And that part of the vibrancy of democracy is sort of precisely the fact that we have Donald Trump, and then we have the wonderful people who arise in response to Donald Trump to basically tell him he's wrong. And that's one of the ways that we articulate our values and who we are. And, you know, politics is about fight.
On campaign use of technology, I think people are getting more and more control over the types of messages that they receive. We have caller ID, and we can keep our email and cell phones basically away from campaigns. I mean, something that I do here in Iowa is I just ignore the phone and don't answer it when I don't know the number. We'll see how long that lasts because it's getting more and more frequent. But the basic idea is, are we sort of at the peak of the use of technology on campaigns, or is there some sort of limit to which the technology advances can really influence campaign tactics?
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say is that if recent history is any guide, it seems that every election cycle there's a new platform that in some way has forced candidates to respond to it. So in this election cycle, it's Instagram, which is now the top social network site behind Facebook in terms of use. And I think candidates are now engaging in trying to create different images of themselves, much more personalized images of themselves, and putting it out there. So I suspect just in the future we'll see more and more of this. I think there will continue to be change at the application layer of the internet. And that as a medium, the internet is changing a lot more dramatically and a lot faster than television or radio, which in essence kind of remains stable. Television, at least from the 1940s on up until like the cable news or cable broadcasting revolution in the 70s and 80s. But I think you see a much faster rate of technological change at the application layer of the internet. And I suspect that will always be part of the environment that candidates will have to deal with in some way.
I think just one thing, too, that I noticed, so if you looked at, in thinking here on the sort of gender perspective of it, but from 2008 to 2016, the responsiveness using technology or using media is very different, right? And so now we see sort of organizations, advocates, folks who are concerned, particularly about gender bias, using technology as a way to confront that in the campaign that we just didn't see before. There was very little of that at all in 2008, and even since then in 2012, in the 2012 campaign. And so the increase of users as well, I think, outside of just the professionals, but the public that's going to engage in the debate online may also continue to increase.
Although let me suggest that when we talk to people who do technology for campaigns, it's very rare that they try to understate their role in the campaign. And, it's really very easy to get a sense that all of this tremendous amount of compilation of data is advancing us to the same degree that the first compilation of data did. There have been all kinds of studies about, Republicans are more likely to drink Coors beer, Democrats are more likely to drink Pabst. After a certain point, how much does it help a campaign to know, do you like your lemonade with sugar or without? We're getting close to the point now where a number of campaigns are saying, you know what, let's just see which party's ballot they picked up in the primary, and let's forget about the Coors beer or the Pabst. This is not necessarily helping us. The socioeconomic and political partisanship factors are really just as key now as they ever have been.
How long do you think until broadcast and print media is obsolete? Will it ever be? Will social and web media be our sole source of news in the future?
Well, I think you'll see convergence. I think the boundaries around what those things are will start to become very fuzzy, as we're already seeing. The New York Times is basically a multimedia company as much as a producer of a printed newspaper. And if you think about not only the New York Times, but what is the New York Times? Well, it's also all their reporters who have disaggregated the brand and are also presences on Twitter as well, right? So I think the ways that we think about what's media, what's legacy media, what's new media, is just intensely complicated, and it's very complicated as researchers to study this as well. But I don't think anything will quite go obsolete. I think what will happen is that digital media will underpin everything, just like it does radio now. And then B, I think that you'll start to see just genres take shape, start to merge, start to change over time.
Yeah, the other sort of interesting thing is that, I think Professor Hershey's certainly right that, we've oversold the role of technology, right, in terms of all these things. So Atan Hirsch has a nice book where he shows that a lot of the things people try to do with that just basically completely fall apart. That, the only really accurate stuff you get are basically, how often have you voted? And if you're in a state that discloses party ID, I don't know if Iowa is or not, and it's voter file. Those are, those basically are the only things that work well in those exercises. But one way in which technology has really changed is, picking up something we were saying a few minutes ago, is that candidates now can respond back in sort of a different way. So I think that will probably change more. Like, so if you look at, the New York Times, now there's this sort of constant kind of churn as to, like, even if the same, basic story is there, right, they're kind of updating and evolving, and they have these little boxes that pop up, and they tell you, like, oh, well, now we've, heard back, right, and this person is sort of responding to the story, or we've updated it in this way. So I think, the interactivity of it will sort of change, right, and it's less a sort of discrete record of, like, what happened on this day than this kind of updated, evolving stream of what is happening.
Okay, I think maybe last question. How do you predict media coverage will change if Clinton is elected president? Do you see the entrance of more and more female candidates and elected representatives changing the norms surrounding gender bias in the media?
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting stories about her having this dominantly female press pool gets to this question about, as well, not only will her presence potentially change how we talk about gender, but also will it change the sort of gender dynamics among the reporters themselves? And one question that sort of emerges from that is, do news outlets choose the women, oh, well, this is the woman candidate, so here we need to send our female reporters on the campaign, and there's a bit of that happening. And then there's also, in the report that was done for Politico on this, some evidence that there's also self-selection. So there's an excitement among female reporters potentially of examining the potential for a female president. I think that inevitably it elevates, hopefully, the conversation around stereotypes because she challenges some of those persistent stereotypes. She's not qualified, and women aren't going to be qualified enough. How can they do the job? This seems so abnormal. If you start to normalize that in the way that Obama did as well vis-a-vis race, that it at least sort of brings us to new and different questions. It doesn't mean we're rid of bias, because again, I would say Obama demonstrates that's not true, right? In some ways, it amplifies it in some circles, depending on what type of media you're using. So I think we'll see both. But again, where I think the importance is the response to it, and the ways in which you sort of see a backlash to the bias that we haven't seen as much in the past.
Another thing we're going to see is that if we return to a Caucasian American president, what's going to happen in terms of the role of race in American society. My husband likes to refer to something he calls ODS, Obama derangement syndrome, that he sees periodically on social media of people who seem to have a pretty violent view of President Obama that seems to be racially tinged. Sometimes greater exposure, as I think Kelly suggests, varies our view of something, differentiates it, helps it to become more normalized. Sometimes it makes it more extreme. We see those findings in terms of physical integration of students in schools, for example, that greater tolerance occurs among some kiddos and greater race hatred occurs among others. What I'm very curious to see is what happens when President Obama leaves the White House, and whether or not the very intense set of responses we've had about race in the last few years, not that they haven't existed before that, but that they've become much more overt recently, will change.
Okay. Thank you to the wonderful panelists and for everyone coming out and asking questions. And please stay for the final panel that we have coming up at 3 o'clock. Okay, thank you.